Hello, I'm Heather Kostick. I'm the Administrative Coordinator for the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media. Welcome to our event, Breaking Down the Scheme with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. I'm going to introduce Dr. Michael Mann, and who will open our event with some remarks and introductions. Dr. Michael Mann is the Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania, with a secondary appointment in the Annenberg School for Communication. He's the director of the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media, and Dr. Mann is the author of more than 200 peer-reviewed and edited publications, numerous op-eds and commentaries, and 5 books, including his newest, The Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. He's also a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a recipient of numerous awards and prizes, including the Tyler Prize, which is often called the Nobel Prize of Environmental Science. And so without further ado, here is Dr. Mann.
Thanks so much, Heather. It is truly a pleasure to welcome Senator Sheldon Whitehouse to Penn. I'm proud to know Sheldon as a leading champion of climate action in our Congress, a fellow climate warrior who has singularly taken the fight to the bad actors, and indeed as a dear friend. And I say all of that despite him having compared me to a ferret, actually in the kindest possible way, in his wonderful new book, The Scheme, which we're about to hear much more about. And so without further ado, let me now introduce my colleague Kathleen Morrison, who will formally introduce Senator Whitehouse. Kathleen Morrison is chair of the Department of Anthropology and the Sally and Alvin V. Shoemaker Professor of Anthropology and co-chair of the Penn Environmental Initiative. Her research is focused on work on long-term histories of farming and on changes in land use and land cover in South Asia, and on the use of paleo-environmental and archaeological data in climate models. Her books include Daroji Valley, Landscape History, Place in the Making of a Dryland Reservoir System, the Vijayanagara Metropolitan Survey, and Fields of Victory. I'll say it again, Vijayanagara, and the Course of Intensification. Professor Morrison earned her PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley in 1992, her MA from the University of New Mexico in 1987, and her BA from the University of Notre Dame, 1984.
Okay. Very much. That's how I can tell this is not a South Asian studies event, right? That the word Vijayanagara is a little terrifying. So I'm delighted to be here and to have the opportunity to moderate this discussion. And to first introduce Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Senator Whitehouse has served as the junior United States Senator from Rhode Island since 2007. He's a member of the Democratic Party, and he served as a United States Attorney from 1993 to 1998, and as the 71st Attorney General of Rhode Island from 1999 to 2003. As you heard, Senator Whitehouse is known for his progressive politics, and he's been a vocal champion for climate change and policy in government. He's been known to reach across the aisle and to work with folks like James Inhofe on grants for small manufacturers on workforce training, and Roger Wicker on legislation that clamps down on laundering money through U.S. financial system, money being a key factor of this talk today, I think. Following his earlier book, Captured, on the corporate capture of regulatory and government agencies, and his years of experience as a prosecutor, Senator Whitehouse here turns his attention to the right-wing scheme to capture the courts and how it influenced the Trump administration's appointment of over 230 business-friendly judges, including the last 3 justices of the United States Supreme Court. He received his bachelor's degree from Yale and his law degree from the University of Virginia Law School. While I'm standing up here, I'd also like to introduce another one of our panelists, my friend and colleague, Joe Francisco. Joseph Francisco is a Presidential Distinguished Professor of Earth and Environmental Science. He's a professor of chemistry here at Penn. He's also the co-chair with me of the Environmental Innovations Initiative. He's currently a fellow of the American Physical Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And in 2010, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In his research, Professor Francisco has applied new tools from theoretical chemistry to atmospheric chemical problems to enhance our understanding of chemistry in the atmosphere at the molecular level. He earned his PhD in chemical physics from MIT and his bachelor's in chemistry from the University of Texas at Austin.
Okay. So I believe,
Maybe now.
Sheldon, the
Mic is fine?
the stage is now yours.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here at Penn. This is a treat, and it's always a treat to be with a friend and hero, Michael Mann. I suppose I should elaborate a little bit on the ferret metaphor. The fossil fuel industry developed a technique for finding climate scientists who annoyed them and brutalizing and harassing them so that they would stop annoying them. And they came after Michael quite forcefully, including using a stoogey Attorney General of Virginia to come and harass him and try to get all of his emails and things like that. Litigation that went all the way to the Virginia Supreme Court, which the University of Virginia won, defending Michael. But that's the kind of stuff that he was up against. And of course, Michael was a very good climate scientist who had developed the original hockey stick that was the kind of key thing for Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth movie, which was what provoked them. But once they were provoked and went after him, he in turn was provoked and dedicated his considerable talents not just to pursuing climate science, but to exposing climate denial. And it was in that context that I said that going after Michael Mann was like grabbing a ferret by the teeth. And they probably regret that choice. If they could dial back to Virginia and recapitulate there, they might just have left him alone. So it's terrific to be here. I'll say a few words about the book. It is part textbook. It is part, sorry, I know that's a little alarming. It is part detective story, which I think is a little bit more appealing. It is part what I would call in my old job pros memo. If you're preparing a case before you actually indict, you write an internal memo, a prosecution memo, a pros memo that lays out the case and gives proof that you've considered all the different risks and what your evidence will show and how the witnesses will turn up. And also it's the document that your supervisors review before the case is cleared to go. So it's a pros memo as well. And it's also a warning flare about a very serious problem at the Supreme Court that we're going to have to pay a lot more attention to in the years ahead. In order to understand the book, you have to understand two concepts. And so I want to mention those two concepts briefly because it gives some sense to what I'm saying. The first is regulatory capture, which is often called agency capture, and which is a doctrine that has persisted for years in the United States. There's a very substantial literature of agency capture or regulatory capture in the economics profession. There's a very substantial literature of agency capture or regulatory capture in the field of administrative law. And if you want a practical example of agency capture or regulatory capture, think about a 19th century railroad commission whose membership was stacked by the railroad barons with commissioners who would do exactly what the railroad barons told them to do. More recently, imagine the Minerals Management Service in the years and months leading up to the explosion of the oil rig in the Gulf. the thing about regulatory capture is that it often works quite well, and its primary strategy is by selecting the membership of the body. And for many, 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 many years, that practice existed within administrative and regulatory agencies. It took some measure of indecency to think about taking that strategy, leaping over to the judicial branch of government and using it to capture courts, including the Supreme Court. But once somebody had that idea and began to execute that plan, the court fell virtually without contest. So it worked horrifyingly well. And it's in that context that you have to consider the court. This is not a conservative court. Not a conservative court. Not by any measure of judicial conservatism is this a conservative court. What it is a captured court that regularly does the bidding of those who put the members on the court, irrespective of the doctrine that it takes to produce that result. Now, you can't very well do that in plain view completely. So the other concept you need to understand is of covert operations. The intelligence services of the world very often run covert operations in and against other countries, and they often use a lot of disinformation to try to disrupt the countries. They often take people and turn them so that they are actually agents of the scheme. They will set up fake organizations to look like real organizations, but actually to do the mischief of the Foreign Intelligence Agency, and they traffic consistently in lies, not because they are there to tell the truth, but because the lies provide the effect in the society that they're trying to disrupt or control. And again, there was sort of a decency factor that was stuff you did only through intelligence agencies and in other countries. In this case, an American industry decided to do that in and against our own country. But the tradecraft that was used to capture the court is very like the tradecraft of intelligence agency covert operations. So you have to bear those two things in mind. Now, Democrats suck at exposing this stuff. We are very easy adversaries to beat. It takes a lot of information before we notice things. So they learned very sloppy tradecraft habits, and now that we've awoken to it a little bit, there's, I think, a lot of evidence that the book tries to summarize. Now, I will stop there, but you may be wondering why, in a discussion about a book that involves the Supreme Court, I have a panel of really expert scientists. The reason is that if you take a look at science denial, which is a really important field of study in which Michael Mann is one of the great experts, the groups that put up climate denial and the groups that participated in court capture, there's enormous overlap between the two. It's not complete congruence. Leonard Leo, for instance, who was the architect of the court capture operation, I've never caught involved in climate denial, but if you look at the two operations, they are extremely, extremely redundant with one another. They play in both spaces, they have the same funding behind them, and an important goal of capturing the court was to keep it from cleaning up the climate mess, to make sure that it undid the Obama Clean Power Plan, to rule the way they wanted in West Virginia versus EPA. So if you understand the way the operation works that captured the court, you see that same operation behind climate denial. So in fact, these are not two separate topics, and that's why I'm so excited to be here to participate in the panel. So with that, I think we move to the panel discussion, right?
Absolutely.
All right, I'll sit down.
Great, I'm delighted to, these are actually on? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. We have a lot to talk about, actually, and we were talking a little bit beforehand, so we can maybe even just sort of continue that. One thing that you didn't say about the book is that it's an absolute page turner. I read most of it all in one sitting on an airplane, I confess. But it's also infuriating. I mean, it is absolutely infuriating. And there are many things we can ask, but I think we're going to start with, just a kind of question about the structure of government, right?
Yeah.
So thinking about the Supreme Court and the court's actions, we might first think about that kind of basic civics principle, that we learned in high school about checks and balances. And I believe Joe has a question about that.
Oh,
You do.
I
Joe.
do.
You do.
Yeah, so welcome to Philadelphia, and Philadelphia being the home of the framing of our Constitution.
Yeah, so I've heard.
And so our constitutional founding fathers believed in framing a government with checks and balances amongst the three branches, the executive, legislative, and judiciary. This framing also respects the independence of each of these bodies and credibility that these bodies bring to the table to be able to call into question checks on one another. These bodies also have their own checks, internal checks. Congress, for instance, has internal checks and controls and ethics committees. And when reading your book, I kept coming back to the question, are there internal checks within the Supreme Court structure? And if they are they enforceable? Can the same body enforce a check on itself? And then, the whole structure of the judiciary, the Supreme Court provides checks on the appeals and lower courts, but who checks them?
Quis custodiet custodies, right? Who watches the watcher?
Yeah, who watches the watcher?
Well, I'd say two things about that. The first is that the constitutional genius that Philadelphia established in the debates all those years ago had as its primary check and balance the public check on all of government through the election process. And the court is the part of government that is immune from that particular check. And if you look at the mischief that the court has been up to, or more precisely, that the dark money operation that created this court has been up to through the court, it has been to accomplish things that they tried and failed to accomplish through the democratic processes of government. So this is an effort to end around the popular will and impose things through the one branch of government that is not accountable to the people. The second is that largely because we've had a lot of faith in the Supreme Court for many years, largely because the Supreme Court for many years has deserved our confidence, we've not really taken a very close look at the checks on the Supreme Court. And as its peculiar behavior in recent years begins to pile up, it's becoming more and more apparent that the checks and balances that apply to me as a senator, to senior members of the executive branch, to other federal judges simply don't apply to the Supreme Court. I, for instance, have to make pretty robust disclosures anytime somebody gives me stuff. My book reveals that Justice Scalia took 80 hunting trips, and the only two that were disclosed were the one that he died on, so it had to be disclosed, and the one where he got flown there in Air Force Two with Vice President Cheney, and that he was on the passenger list. That's 78 other hunting trips that somebody took him on and not disclosed. Nobody in the executive branch or the legislative branch could get away with that, nor could any federal judge not on the Supreme Court. And what we found recently when we brought up questions about whether there was a violation of ethics on the court, like, for instance, Justice Thomas's refusal to recuse from the case that would have constrained the power of the 1-6 Commission, which was trying to get information which would include his wife's emails involved in the insurrection. It turns out that none of the process for an ethics inquiry exists at the court. There's no inbox where you say, I'd like to make my complaint, and it has any result. There's no inquiry that follows. Obviously, with no inquiry, there's no independent inquiry. There's no ultimate determination that gets made in the ordinary course, and there's no public finding that would let somebody know that their complaint has been heard, fairly considered, and that a resolution has been reached. You just go into this fog of unaccountability, and each justice being the judge of his or her own ethics. And the one thing that's been a little bit good about this, I'll end with this, is that the rest of the federal judiciary, there are a lot of them who are getting pretty frustrated with the way the court is behaving. Because if you are a federal judge and you have to live within these standard guidelines and it's a regular part of your world and you understand where the guardrails are and how this all works, and then you see your Supreme Court violating all of that, you're a really good witness that something has gone wrong, and you resent it a bit because they're doing bad things for the judiciary. It is not helpful to the rest of the judiciary to have the court behaving this way, so damn it, what are we going to do about this? And the result is that at least 2 of the complaints that I've made to the court that the court ignored have now been taken up by the Judicial Conference, which is the administrative body of the federal judiciary. So, you know, it's interesting. There are ways to work around the problem of their own accountability-less nature.
Yeah. I hope we can get back to the money soon, because clearly, you know, that's an animating force running through this. But, you know, thinking about accountability, besides the branches of government and, you should say, the will of the people, there's a whole nother sort of, you know, estate, you might say, and that's the media. And I think Mike would like to talk a little bit about the role of the media in all this.
Yeah, thanks. Sheldon, you discussed the role of plutocrats and corporate dark money, a captured Supreme Court, compromised politicians. But this is, after all, a center for science, sustainability, and the media. Yeah. And so I'm interested in your thoughts about the role of the media in all of this.
So 2 things about the media in all of this. First, beside the legitimate media, there is a right-wing propaganda machine masquerading as media that is operating with real power in our society. Among other things, because they're producing propaganda for big, powerful special interests, they don't have to worry about the bottom line in the same way that a local newspaper, say, might have to worry about making payroll. And second, it's not too hard to be a journalist for a propaganda outlet where you're told what to write, and all you have to do is regurgitate it through your outlet. Michael and I have both shared the experience of seeing the right-wing media universe light up after we've done something with essentially identical articles that all appear at the same time in multiple outlets, in some cases the same author in different outlets because they didn't bother to find different people to put out the article. And one of my favorite moments actually was when the Wall Street Journal, after one of these episodes, had to publish an editorial note declaring that they had not plagiarized from another publication despite the similarity between the 2 articles. And I pointed out that it had not been my charge that they had plagiarized from the other publication. My charge was that both publications were regurgitating the same talking points from the same source. So you have this very robust and slightly masquerade fake media that is being run by the big special interests. The other thing that you have, and it relates to this, is that the regular media is under really intense pressure right now. and it's really hard to make newspapers work. Local newspapers are collapsing rapidly. The people who work in newspapers and in the media are under intense pressure to produce, to try to generate as many clicks as they can. And so if you are given a fully prepped script of talking points, it's very easy to simply put that out. Whereas if you try to look behind all of that or take a step back and look for patterns, that's a lot more difficult. And even today, in coverage about the Supreme Court, in coverage about the Moore v. Harper case, there are regular news media outlets that describe one of the amici in that case, the Honest Elections Project, as a conservative advocacy group. Well, dig a little bit more, and you see not only is it a conservative advocacy group, but it's a conservative advocacy group in a network of corporations, fake entities, basically. It is a fictitious name for a corporate entity that has a twin operating in the same location with the same funders and the same staff, that has another fictitious name, which is called the Judicial Crisis Network, which was taking $15 million checks, $17 million checks, and flipping those checks to put out TV ads against Garland, for Gorsuch, for Kavanaugh, and for Barrett. So particularly in the context of a piece of litigation before the Supreme Court, you've got to be under a lot of pressure in the media when all you see when you see Honest Elections Project is, oh, it's a conservative group. No, it actually is the corporate sibling of part of the machinery that put these judges on the court before which the argument is being made. But it takes a lot of work to figure that out. And under the kind of pressure that real media is under, it's very, very hard for them to do the work to look behind the scam and dig into it and root it out.
Quick follow-up. You elucidated another modus operandi of sort of the denial machine, which is to sort of seize the language, to control the language, to co-opt the language, by taking things like fake news. So there really is conservative fake news, and that's why the actual those who promote actual fake news, right-wing propaganda, as you describe it, have co-opted the terminology fake news. Donald Trump co-opted that term. It's a classic example of projection and sort of, we were talking about this earlier. Yeah. And using... Projection meaning you know what you are doing that is evil. Exactly. You prepare for the attack on being caught doing what you are doing that you know is evil, and you prepare for that by accusing your adversary of doing the thing that you yourself are doing, so that, again, the media has a hard time sorting it out. Now you got two sides accusing each other. It's like, offsetting penalties. What do we do about this? And it's a very, very effective propaganda strategy, as you know all too well, my friend Michael.
One thing that, of course, underpins a lot of this is the fossil fuel industry, right? Oh, yeah. And the book begins by talking about, the role of climate denial and capture of the, as a kind of beginning of the capture of the court. But I want to ask you two things about fossil fuel money on the one hand and the role of that kind of money in the process you described. But also secondarily, it's kind of interesting to think about the persistent cultural attachment to fossil fuels in American life, right? So there was a story recently about the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which people
Fossil Fuel Front
proudly celebrate their high carbon lifestyle. And I think about, the kind of popular animus against the Prius, for example, when it was first out, and rolling coal, right? People who would transform their vehicles to put a lot of smoke and, sort of driving my little Prius down the highway, sometimes I worried about that. So, that's that's a kind of a strange cultural attachment to fossil fuels, which seems connected to the political link of the fossil fuel industry money that you described. So could you just, sort of expand a little bit more on how you think it's fossil fuels in particular that are implicated in the capture of the court that you describe in the book?
Well, I can't really speak to the cultural phenomenon you're discussing other than to point out that there's at least a non-trivial chance that all of that is actually created by money being spent to whip people up or even to invent these things.
That's what I was kind of
The
wondering.
idea that this is a naturally occurring social phenomenon with no support or direction from the fossil fuel industry is probably less likely than the opposite. In terms of the role of the fossil fuel industry, let me give you two numbers. The first is the International Monetary Fund's calculation of the annual subsidy for fossil fuel in the United States of America. Annual. They put it at $660 billion. So if you think about that for a minute, let's just say that you're the fossil fuel industry, you're trying to protect that subsidy at all costs. Most of that subsidy is getting away with polluting for free and not having to bake, as economic theory would suggest, the harm your product causes into the price of your product. So it's a massive, massive subsidy. And if you're trying to protect that every year so that there aren't carbon prices and pollution fees and things like that, and let's just say you spend $6.6 billion every year playing around in politics, you're earning a 10,000% return on equity from that investment. So the idea that big spending in politics by big industry has some natural upward bound is, I think, implausible. And we've got to find other constraints on how people spend money. And now we have the worst situation because we've got absolutely no constraint on how much can be spent, and you can hide that it's you spending it. So you don't even have to face the discipline of people understanding what your motives are when you're out spending it. So we're in a really deep hole when that kind of money is at play in politics, and we have not created adequate defenses against it. I put actually not me, but people who do the research on this, put the cost of the court capture operation somewhere north of $580 million. Somebody spent more than $500 million to fund this court capture operation, and they had to invest it over years, so it was a slow process. So it's really persistent and really thorough. And if you doubt that $580 million is a credible figure, consider that just a few months ago, one eccentric billionaire just made a $1.6 billion donation into Leonard Leo's network of front groups that have been involved in the court capture operation. One donation, one time, $1.6 billion, and it's going to go into that network, and you're never going to see where it comes out because it's going to be hidden as dark money, and it's going to end up, you'll see it as a super PAC spend somewhere, but you'll never be able to connect the dots. So there's big, big, big money, and nobody has a bigger stake than the fossil fuel industry protecting that massive subsidy. So look for their filthy fingerprints everywhere.
It's clear that you're a former prosecutor because in the book, lays out the argument as a kind of court case. And I have to say, if I were in the jury, I would be very convinced. But one thing that, you don't really do is move us more towards solutions, And actually, Joe and Mike and I talked about the book last month, I think, and we'd mostly read everything except the end, and we were hoping that you were going to fix it all for us at the end.
Nope.
So I want to talk about that. I mean, there's sort of two paths. One is financial, perhaps, and one is more political. And Joe had a question about the issue of transparency. When you think of dark money.
Yeah, so your last comment sparked up a perspective that I had about your book. and I can sum it up in 3 words: follow the money.
Yeah, Yeah.
Follow the money.
powerful words.
Yeah.
Follow the money.
Follow the money. And, and believe it or not, that then brought up the whole thing of the president's men with Bernstein.
Yeah,
Again, doing that sort of Watergate thing. It's all about following the money.
Yeah.
Same here. But in terms of solution, I think one of the things that kind of be argued is that perhaps we need some kind of mechanism to kind of expose, lift the veil of who's behind the dark money, to allow us to be able to kind of follow that money, if that is possible. Now, I was kind of just trying to figure out how you would do that, and I kept coming back to the antitrust laws, as kind of a way of kind of combating and going about this in a process way. But it kind of occurred that the Constitution kind of protects.
there is this petitioning clause.
There's a petitioning
Yeah.
clause that kind of puts a limit, on that, and so that's perhaps not the most and best way to go after that, because that could easily be battled in Congress and whatever. But maybe an alternative direction would be to kind of work through the Disclosure Act. And so my question is there any way in which the Disclosure Act could be strengthened to kind of address the issues about the dark money and bringing more awareness of where that money is flowing and who's it flowing to and from, as a kind of way of restricting the influence of that dark money on government corruption?
Well, the easiest way to do that would be if we would pass my bill that does exactly that. We actually had a vote on it in this Congress, and every single Democrat voted to pass the bill. Unfortunately, every single Republican voted against it, and so we're still in a bit of a blockade, and regrettably, we have Democrats who will not work to find a way around the 60-vote cloture rule, even for something as essential as this. Just a quick word of background on that. Citizens United was the god-awful Supreme Court decision that opened unlimited political spending in our politics. Like the entities who have unlimited funds and have enormous stakes in politics didn't already have enough advantages. So they went ahead and did that. The premise of the decision was that non-transparent money, dark money, was corrupting. And that's why they had to bake into the decision the false premise that it was all going to be transparent. So if you take Citizens United on its face, it establishes the proposition by an 8-to-1 vote that dark money is corrupting. And the public hates it. The polling on this is through the roof. It is passionate hatred. And another hero of mine is Jane Mayer. Jane Mayer did that terrific New Yorker article where she got her hands somehow on either a tape or a transcript of a conversation between Mitch McConnell's little minions and the Koch brothers' little minions, minioning together on how to plot political stuff. And they were talking about an issue that was kryptonite to them. And no matter how they tried to massage it and dirty it up and twist it and torque it around, they got no place with it. And they were furious because it was just as infuriating to their Tea Partiers as it was to, Bernie bros. And that issue was dark money. So there's huge popular antagonism towards all of this for good reason. As a matter of law, it is prima facie corrupting. And yet, there it is. And the Republicans are voting to defend it. Why? because they're so dependent on dark money that they can't get away from it. It's like a deep-sea diver, being dependent on the air hose that comes down from the mother ship. You torque the air hose, and suddenly the deep-sea diver will do anything you say to get the oxygen flowing again. So yeah, disclosure will do a world of good. You turn on the lights and the cockroaches scuttle is the simplest way to say it.
We're almost out of time, unfortunately, but I wonder if we can let Mike have the last word quickly about the possibility of bipartisanship.
Yeah, thanks. As Sheldon, as you mentioned, we both have had some common experiences. We've been attacked by that, the sort of fake outrage machine that is drummed up when you are taking the fight to the bad actors. We also have a friend in common. You worked with John McCain. I believe that was on finance, campaign finance reform.
Yeah. He and I wrote a brief together to the Supreme Court talking about this transparency problem.
He was also when Joe Barton, the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, Republican chair of that committee, largest recipient of fossil fuel money in the U.S. House of Representatives. He resigned some years ago. Do not do a Google image search on Joe Barton. I've warned you. You'll find out why he resigned. When he came after me, in the same way that Ken Cuccinelli and others did, one of the first Republicans to stand up to him was John McCain, who authored a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education, stopping just short of calling out his fellow Republican as a modern-day McCarthyist. So my question to you is that a bygone era? Are figures like John McCain even possible in this hyper-politicized environment that we live in today, where big, dark money has such influence, has captured, to use your terminology, one of the two major parties? Is there any hope for crossing, working with those across the aisle today and passing legislation?
Let's look at this through the lens of climate change. When I got to the Senate, I was there through 07, 08, and 09, and we were regularly working on bipartisan climate legislation. There were 4 different measures kicking around in the Senate. One of them was John McCain's. You remember, he ran for president carrying the Republican banner into that election with a robust climate change platform. Then came January of 2010. In January of 2010, the Supreme Court decided Citizens United, and all bipartisanship on climate change instantly stopped, I believe, because the fossil fuel industry went into Mitch McConnell and into the House leadership and said, fun's over. Anybody messes with on climate and you're dead. You help us, we have now unlimited money to spend for you. We can hide it, you won't be tagged with us. You can get $20 million checks, $40 million checks. We'll set up super PACs. We own you now. And if you're Bob Inglis, we hang you, the Republican congressman who got blown out in a primary when he wouldn't kowtow. And that changed everything, which means we can, in fact, go back to that day. But we have to eliminate the cause of that change, which was the unlimited dark money. The good news is the public hates it so much that we can get this done. The bad news is the Democrats too often are satisfied with a show vote on this issue. Oh, we did that, check the box. As opposed to treating it as a high priority and continuing to pound that issue home until we win. Because we will win if we continue to pound it. So yes, there is hope for bipartisanship on climate. There is hope for, frankly, a better Senate and a better Congress. But that's not going to happen until the underlying scourge of dark money is lifted off of our politics. And that's going to take effort. And regrettably, Senate Democrats have not put in adequate effort.
Thank you very much. I think we have a little bit of time for audience question and answer, and I know that you're all eager to get a copy of the book and to get it signed. So Heather, so we have some microphones going around, maybe back here. Okay, so we have some Zoom questions coming in, and Eric, why don't we start with the in-person first? What time are we supposed supposed to stop.
Who in Congress do you like specifically refer to when you say like show votes is what they are looking for? I mean, like, of course, it's going to be a larger body of people, but if you were to put out names that like are satisfied with that kind of show voting, who would you say? I don't know if you're allowed to say that. I don't know if you're trying to make enemies right now.
No. I think in my world, there are a great number of competing priorities. And there are a great number of advocacy groups and interests that are trying to get attention. And the coin of the realm is floor time, because you can't make any more of it than you're going to get. So it's really, really important. And the result is floor time tends to get divvied up. And you tend to want to go to, okay, we had the civil rights vote. Okay, we had the environmental vote. Okay, we had the anti-abortion vote. Okay, we had the child tax credit vote. Okay, we had the, and and it becomes a bit of a checkmark type process. So in fact, we did call up the Disclose Act. In fact, we did vote on it. There was probably a day or so of debate with people talking about it. The president gave a little speech to help give it a little push. But it's not so much that there's individuals to blame. It's that if you let things stay in that category, then all you end up with is that show vote, because the pressure of all the other issues competing for it is what allows you to push it aside. I think that we're missing a huge opportunity with not making dark money and corruption front and center, and just going at it day after 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 day until we've repeated it to the point of ad nauseum. And then I think the public pressure in favor begins to work against the Republicans. But if they can withstand one day of bad press, that's not asking them too much in return for 24/7, 365, millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars in dark money pouring in every day. So we just got to change our prioritization of this, I think.
Just a quick follow-up comment. As you were describing that day after day after day after, it reminded me of the Frank Luntz adage, just when you think you've, repeated it too many times, they're just beginning to hear.
Yeah. Unless you're so sick of your stump speech and it makes you want to throw up, you haven't repeated it enough to sink in, is another adage.
Sorry for the quick follow-up. What would you say is specifically stopping you? What would you say is specifically stopping you from going in on that and making that something that you can do day to day? I mean, there's probably many things, but if you were to list out one or two of the important ones.
Well, that's one of the reasons I've been going every week without fail until the Biden administration. Then I got disappointed and started back up again with the Time to Wake Up speeches, which focused on the web of denial and called it out over and over and over again. And that's why I talk nonstop about the dark money problem, to the point that I have colleagues who roll their eyes. Oh, dark money, here he goes again.
Yeah. It's heroic.
Heather, do we have a question from the Zoom audience?
Yes, we have a couple of questions. The first one that came in said, isn't the problem the Constitution itself? That is what constrains the Supreme Court.
So.
They can't issue rulings unless they find a justification in that now outdated document. So it's continually evident that this document can be interpreted in ways that are harmful to the public.
No.
Thank you.
All right. We do have another Zoom question that came at the same time. Would the panelists say that the issue, given the senator's point of competing priorities, is a critique of the Democratic Party being a big tent, so big that it's working against itself?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And just as an observer of the political scene I inhabit, the Democratic Party is essentially a cat herd of competing interest and advocacy groups, and within each interest and advocacy area are competing individual groups, who quarrel with each other and are rivals with each other for prominence within their issue. I tell my friends in the environmental community that their battle planning is worse than when the Assyrians and the Hittites fought in the area of cuneiform. And, here we are in the area of the internet, and we just act like we're all just going to run out of the bushes all at once yelling as if that's going to be a strategy. So, yeah, we have a big advantage as the Democratic Party, I believe, in that I think we actually are responsive to the public in a lot of really important ways. What we have not yet had the capability to do is to have the command nodule in which people get together and try to strategize in what order you do things and when there are opportunities that you can seize to gain progress. We don't have that kind of battle planning, usually even within an advocacy area, let alone across advocacy areas, whereas the big Republican donors are meeting constantly, and they're sending out, it's a very command and control type operation. Fair description, Mike?
Yeah, some people describe it as an ideological difference, sort of authoritarian, disciplinarian sort of personality types versus egalitarian. And so there's that fundamental asymmetry, I think, as well, in sort of who's a Democrat, who's a Republican.
Yeah, I think you're slandering the Hittites, too, because they're really an incredibly effective military. But as far as herding cats, you should feel right at home here at a university, and I think. We have another question from the audience. Is Simon? There should be. Aaron, could you read over?
One there, and then you. Go ahead.
Okay, we'll go
Since
over
the
here,
mic
and
is
then-
there,
and
start
then
there, and then
Simon.
we'll move up. Go ahead with the mic right there. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for speaking today and for assembling this panel and for all the organizers. This is great. Senator, I went to school in the great state of Rhode Island. I went to...
Hooray.
Hooray. And so it's great to see a familiar face. And yourself and the panelists have described this great gap, this divide, this aisle, and reaching across it. And a couple questions ago, there was a follow-up question about reaching across this divide and how to do that in a quotidian manner. And this may be out of the scope, out of the range of this this panel, but I'm wondering how each of you do that in your everyday lives. Reach across the divide when, say, someone disagrees with you, or say you have a colleague and there's no way not to work with this colleague because you work in the same place or you work on the same project or you work together. How it doesn't need to be a big way, maybe in some small ways, do you manage to work together? I'd like to know. Thank you.
You've got to understand, I think, where some boundaries are in order to be effective at that. I'm in the top 10 of Democrats in terms of getting things done in a bipartisan fashion. And if you think of us as having a big playground, and you carve out a piece of the playground where you can do bipartisan stuff, I am happy to play in that playground and do bipartisan stuff. But then there's another part of the playground in which you simply cannot do bipartisan stuff. And you cannot do bipartisan stuff not because your colleagues are evil people, but because the political equation for them does not permit them to do bipartisan things. So in order to address those problems, you've got to look beyond just your colleagues. It's not a question of personality. You've got to go after the causes that are preventing them from doing the things that need to be done. We just sent a letter to the UN, 3 of us who went to the COP in Egypt, the Paris Agreement negotiations, and there were lobbyists all over the place from the fossil fuel industry who said, you know what? You should not allow a corporation to come to another COP unless it is filed with you a climate political disclosure statement, an audited climate political disclosure statement. So if they're coming to COP to greenwash while they're paying the Chamber of Commerce to kill climate legislation in the United States of America, everybody should know that when they show up, and that should be their ticket to admission. So that's one way of many that I've tried to create pressure points outside of the playground, if you will, to expand the area in which bipartisanship is possible by trying to dilute or deflect the outside pressures that lock in our Republican colleagues.
I can't speak for all of us, but I think I would be remiss, sitting here if we didn't also mention the role of education, from, birth till death, that people can learn. And this is something that is, university scholars and teachers is very important to us. We're getting short on time, but we have one more question. Simon's been sitting there patiently. And then after this, we'll go on to the book signing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Whitehouse. I'd like to ask a comparative question. So I interact with a lot of European colleagues, and they are pretty smug about the difference between their democratic system and ours, and especially with regard to dark money, and other things too, of course. But what I notice is that the fossil-free industry, or the fossil-free. Why do I say fossil-free? Because I'm a great supporter of fossil-free. The fossil fuel industry, seems to have no difficulty in influencing politics in Europe as well. And so, I think the premise of your book, of your argument, I buy it. If we could get dark money out of the picture, that would make this a much brighter place. But this comparison suggests that the fossil fuel industry is immensely resourceful and has other ways to advance its
It does. But if you look recently at the massive price gouging that the fossil fuel industry engaged in, the reaction in Britain from a Tory conservative government was to pass an excess profits clawback. That's my bill. Ro Khanna joined me on it on the House side, and we have been fighting for that. We can't get a single Republican co-sponsor. Our Conservative Party is completely in tow to the fossil fuel industry. In Great Britain, it was Conservative Party policy to do that. They have far greener policies than we do on plastics. The European companies are a mile ahead of American companies. I think that there are a lot of ways in which the corrupting advantage that big industries have through dark money in the United States manifests itself in measurable differences between political behavior in the United States and political behavior in the EU. There's a reason that the EU is about to have a carbon border adjustment mechanism and has approved conceptually the idea and is now just working on implementation. We're just beginning to think about that. So there are innumerable ways in which I think there is a measurable difference between the two, and if I had the time and could do a good academic study on that, I think it would be pretty interesting to see what those ways are. But I think the toxicity of dark money in American politics reveals itself in a lot of US versus EU comparisons, UK comparisons too.
Well, I know you're eager to, okay. Excellent. Thank you, Heather. I'm trying to be a good citizen here and keep us to time, so.
Just quick, I was going to ask you another question, but this came to mind. Do you know of, could you envision working with someone on a solutions companion to your book, to the professor's point about solutions?
Yeah.
And secondly, are you aware of, or do you intend to organize a Winehouse for President committee?
Amy Winehouse?
White House, I mean.
White House for the White House.
That's not going to happen.
Easy to remember.
My son and daughter are here, and they would both come and murder me on behalf of my wife. So I think that the prescription for the disease that I identify is fairly evident from the disease itself. I think that the fundamental toxicity that has occurred has been the dark money explosion since Citizens United. The public is speaking with real force in many respects. There's a very interesting graphic that I have seen that compares the recent competitive Senate races, and at the end of the day, how much dark money, how much what they called independent expenditure came in for Republicans versus Democrats. Some it's pretty much a tie. But in a lot of those races, the Democrat massively, massively, massively outraised the Republican. There are some races in which 90% of the money was outside spending on behalf of the Republican. That's not a real candidate. That's a propped up puppet. And if that dark money weren't there, I would say we would not have a 51 vote majority. We'd have a 53 or 54 vote majority. So getting after the dark money then opens the door to the public being heard, and that opens the door to the Republican Party being more responsive to the public instead of the big dark money donors, and things start to move. At the court, it's a little bit different because it's gotten itself in such a rotten position that it now has to go back and bat cleanup and do a lot of the ethics reforms that will bring it into line with the rest of the federal judiciary. It can't be an outlier any longer because it has ruined its credibility to stand as an outlier. So I think there's a whole package of reforms that need to happen at the Supreme Court that is a little bit different. But I truly, truly believe if we got rid of this massive dark money spending, the temperature would come down in this country. Bipartisanship would reemerge in this country. The public would be much more satisfied with outcomes. I think we're in a situation of considerable public dissension, in part because they may not know exactly how or why, but they know Congress isn't listening. And from my seat, I know who they're listening to because I can see it.
Wow. On that note, Heather will give you directions on the book signing.
So on behalf of hopefully this is on, Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media, we want to thank you for coming to our event today. If you are interested in purchasing a book and having it signed by Senator Whitehouse, he will be here for the next 45 minutes to do so. You can line up over here, and I want to thank the Annenberg Public Policy Center for having us in here, and all of our panelists for being here, and especially Senator Whitehouse for making us part of your book tour.
I should mention that if you do buy the book and you look at the dedication, you'll see that Michael Mann is one of the people to whom it's dedicated, the band of scientists who exposed the climate denial operation.
Oh, shucks.
Thank you.
Thank you.